Let's continue our visual analysis of these data by plotting an example time series. To do so, let's plot the EEG data from condition A in the first trial and all time points. When we issue this command, a figure appears, and we can begin by inspecting the axes in this figure. So the vertical axis corresponds to microvolts. Let's not examine that in detail now. Let's instead consider the horizontal axis, which in this case corresponds to indices. Ideally, we'd like to plot these voltage data as a function of time rather than indices. Fortunately, we can do that using another variable in our workspace, the variable t. Let's start by inspecting the variable t. We can look at the first index for the variable t. This corresponds to a time of 0.002 seconds, or 2 milliseconds. We can also look at the last index in t. We can ask what is the last index in this vector t, and it has a value of 1. This tells us that our first trial runs for approximately 1 second of data. We can also examine or define a useful quantity called the sampling interval, dt. Let's define that to be t2 minus t1. So we find in this case a sampling interval of 0.002 seconds or 2 milliseconds. Now using this variable t, we can now make a more informative plot of our EEG data. Let's plot on the horizontal axis t and on the vertical axis the data from the EEG in the first condition A for the first trial and all time points. Let's also label the axes in this plot. We'll define an X label here, which will correspond to time, which we know is in seconds. I've also defined a Y label, which corresponds to the voltage, in this case microvolts. And finally, let's define a title for our plot. Define it to be EEG data from condition A in the first trial, trial 1. And with that, we now have created an informative figure for these data. We notice through visual inspection that this figure is rather complicated. Through visual inspection alone, it may be difficult to pull out any interesting features. We talked to our collaborator, who tells us that the stimulus occurs at a particular time in these data. It occurs at time 0.25 seconds. So with that, we now have a figure we can use to begin a visual inspection of our data. You might consider, do we see anything of interest around the time of stimulus onset?